I've only got one sentence written down here. I don't know why I got my iPad in front of me. Oh. By the way, if you ordered one of these Pythagorean incommensurable, the center is made out of alligator, the outside is made out of buffalo. I'm working hard on them, but I'm going slowly. How about baby blue? You know, it's hard to find baby blue alligators out in the wild. You know, one of the things that people found really fascinating, I do live streams 3 times a week, and every time it goes over 2 hours now, which is a lot of time. A lot of time on live stream. And people found fascinating. If you give people the answers to stuff, then they don't think. And it's good to think. When people are spoon-fed answers, their brain doesn't engage. It's kind of like having one of those autopilot things on in your car. It's like, take a left. Of course, I actually don't want to go back to the days of pulling out the map and pulling off to the side of the road, which is what I used to do. If you're old enough to remember that, you know, I was old enough. You had to go and pull off the side of the road and ask directions or get a map. We're talking about life, and of course life is the consubstantiality of matter and spirit. Yes? Consubstantiality means it's composed of 2 or more constituents. Yeah? Like water, for example, is composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom. By the way, of course, water is the dipole antenna of life. Life is not possible without water. Of course, without water, then human beings are just a handful of dust. Right? So that's certainly the case. And that, in our analogy, the radio analogy would be the antenna. Yeah. But in the case of the radio analogy, it's not only the antenna, it would also be the circuitry that's attached to the antenna and the processing of that. It's a holographic dipole antenna. I don't know if you know what a dipole antenna is. An inverted V dipole actually almost looks identical to the water molecule, and of course it's a perfect incommensurability geometry in the entire universe. It's actually the basis of Pythagorean incommensurability that they called yugata. Yugata is often translated, and I have yugata actually tattooed right here on my knuckles, yugata, at the 5 points of the pentagram. And the pentagram is actually 3 of those 1, 1, 5 triangles. You actually have 1 here, and 5 down here. 1 is the 5, 5 is the 1. Anyway, I could talk about that for hours and hours and hours. It actually means harmony, symmetry. Symmetry of perfection between 2 things. The very thing which makes manifestation possible. And of course, the antenna, without this antenna, and of course this is not an expensive radio, but without this antenna, nothing is tunable. You can turn it on, and actually you get, if the signal is strong enough, you get a really scratchy signal, but it's just not going to work. So it's synonymous with the antenna. So the question is, in using retroductive logic, and this is the lost secret of the Pythagoreans, working your way backward, not induction, deduction, yeah, like a la Sherlock Holmes, but retroduction, working your way backwards to understand the nature of subjective things which are not objectively knowable. They're not objectively knowable because they're subjective by definition. So death, of course, is not the opposite of life. Death is the end of life. It's the breakup of the consubstantiality between matter and spirit. There's no soul in the body. There's no signal in the radio. There's no actual fire in this monitor. Yet that's not a denial of fire. Saying there's no soul in the body is certainly not a denial of the soul, obviously and logically so, correct? Well, of course that's correct. Atheists, however, perfect analogy for them, the atheist is a symbol for the soul and the house is a representation for the body. The atheist steps outside of the house and looks in the window and says there's nobody here. And then they, of course, deny the soul. And, of course, that's metaphysical atheism. Atheism, actually, in its original definition of atheos, vis-a-vis the Greeks and the Platonists, was not about a denial of God, was a denial about subjective substrates underneath phenomena. In other words, the atheist, metaphysical atheist, what a true atheist is, admits to the sock puppet, but there's no hand underneath. But that's a matter for another discussion. So death is the opposite, excuse me, not the opposite of, but the end of life, the breakup between the consubstantiality. It'd be perfectly synonymous with breaking this radio. Say I dropped it down the stairs, it's all still there, as in the case of a dead person, but the signal is no longer tunable, or like the battery is dead. You know, you have so much time, the battery's going to die. You know, the clock will eventually unwind itself, and of course human beings don't have a mainspring on the side where you can continually wind the thing in perpetuity. Of course, even a regular mechanical pocket watch can't be wound forever. You know, it has a certain life. So that would be death, of course, the end of life. So then the question becomes, what is the opposite of life? If death is not the opposite of life, since death is the end of life, we had a discussion about this, and it fascinated the hell out of everybody in live stream, which I found odd. A lot of the stuff that I actually take for granted and I find, blatantly obvious, other people's like, wow, I never thought about that before. It makes things so abundantly clear. Life, of course, is embodiment. Then what's the opposite of life? The opposite of life would be disembodiment. But by disembodiment, not meaning death, where, of course, the spirit is now not consubstantial with the body, that is a disembodied being. But the opposite of life is transcendence, is liberation. It's the fruit of theurgy. It's the premise of jhana. I'll never use the word meditation because the word is completely aspecific. The word jhana comes from the word jayati, which means to burn. But burn what? We got a fire over here. What are we burning away? Well, in the case of wisdom, the logs would be representational for the body. Well, you're not physically burning it, but you're burning it away through retroduction, through theurgy, through synthesis. Embodiment is that lit fire. You're burning away that which you have false identity with due to primordial avidya or agnosis. This is not original sin. This is not first cause. There is no prima cause or first sin. That is something specific to creationism. Yeah? As far as emanationism, vis-a-vis the Platonists, the Greeks, Advaita Vedanta, original Buddhism, the principal Upanishads, there is no original sin. There's not. There's primordial attribute of the Absolute, which means a distinction between light and illumination. Light, of course, would be the agathon of the Absolute. The extrinsic attribute, of course, would be illumination, which is the attribute of light. Light and illumination are inseparably one thing. Nothing is that has at least one attribute. Nobody can even imagine anything, real or imaginary, that doesn't have at least one attribute. So the opposite of life is transcendence, not disembodiment, because death, of course, is disembodiment, where the signal is no longer tuned by the radio.
The upper 40s, lows in the mid-20s. Tuesday night.
What you're hearing is not the signal. That was no weather radio at 162.400 megahertz. What you're hearing then is not the signal. Sure it is. It's 162.400 megahertz. It's 162.4 million cycles per second. That's the signal's interpolation of the radio is being broadcast. That's right. It's the broadcast. That's not the signal. There's no signal in this radio. When I turn, just think about that for a second.
40% chance of rain. Highs in the lower 50s.
Yeah, that's the temperature for Kentucky. When I turn this on, I'm not listening, nor am I incarnating the signal. People's like, is there a soul in the body? It's like, no, you're denying the soul? No, it's not the case. It's like one line. I've ever take a bubble bath. I haven't done it. I've taken a bubble bath in like 30 years maybe. There's like one light overhead in the bathroom, usually one light. You'll see that one light reflected like 1,000 times in 1,000 soap bubbles, the individuation of the one. In each temporal soap bubble, and of course the soap bubble has volume, it has mass, and it has magnitude. It doesn't have much mass, but it has mass and magnitude. And it experiences a temporal life. That is what the soul is, the individuation of the soul. And each soul then, therefore, by its own temporal experiences, becomes individuated and specific. And this would be akin to upper sideband and lower sideband. Each soul would be exactly like the signal, which of course is everywhere and nowhere. There's no Cartesian coordinate. It would be a circle whose radius is nowhere and whose center is everywhere, as the old saying goes from Meister Eckhart. It would be like an upper sideband or lower sideband modulation. It used to be how spies would actually transmit things as upper sideband or lower sideband modulation. Like you tune into a signal, you'd hear this, your ears would hear this, but on the upper sideband or lower sideband of the frequency, there'd be another signal embedded within the signal. So that would be nearly perfect. The radio analogy is not totally perfect, but there's no other analogy on this earth that comes closer to giving people a mental picture of understanding the metaphysical principles of monistic metaphysics vis-a-vis the Greeks and the Indians, so on and so forth. So, what is the opposite of life? It is transcendence. Disembodiment, of course, is just the antarabhava, which means in-between existence, between afterlife and before re-embodiment. That's not reincarnation, actually. That's transmigration. Bob, Sue, Larry, so on and so forth does not reincarnate as people, especially Westerners, conventionally think of it. That is actually not found within the principal Upanishads. It's not even found within the Vedas, and it's not found within original Buddhism either. And Buddhism is called bhava nubhava, which means becoming and rebecoming, or it's also called the transition between antara bhava, which means between becoming, in other words, after death, before re-embodied. By the way, that one word is the complete decimation of all of Theravada and all of the soul-denying nihilists of so-called Buddhism. The reason being is that they don't believe that there is an essence, an essa, or a soul, doesn't matter what word you use, after the breakup of the body. That is the one word. There's many words that they hate to hear, like la 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 la, don't say that word, I don't want to hear it. They admit that it's in doctrine. I'll give you the exact passage from the Theravadeans, those yellow-robed guys running around Southeast Asia. They admit that it's in doctrine. They say this in their own words, but they say this. We admit that this is in doctrine, but it is completely contrary to the teachings of Theravada. In other words, it's genuine to original Buddhism, but the Theravadins don't believe in it. Oh my! Oh no! Who works for whose own good? You know, what good is liberation if there were no self? Who works for whose own good? Udana 81. If there were not an unborn and unoriginated and uncreate, O followers, there would be no escape, therefore, for the born, the originated, and the create. Who works for whose own good? That's all you have to do to ask a Buddhist. Like, yeah, Buddhists will tell you, there's no soul. Well, there's no such passage in doctrine. Well, what about anada and anatman? That means no soul. It's like, no. No. That is used in an adjectival form in all 576 passages found within the Nikayas. It says A, B, C, X, Y, Z are not the soul. This is not the soul, that's not the soul. It is never used in any fashion to state that there's no soul. It's completely ridiculous. The light, the jyoti, the only refuge, is the soul. Attasarana namasarana. The soul is a refuge with none other is refuge. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about Buddhism. And actually, I was not talking about Buddhism, I was talking about original Buddhism, actually doctrinal Buddhism, long before those Theravadins, the Mahayanists, and all the other people that came along. Because even a Christian knows, even like an armchair Christian knows that, you know, Catholicism and Protestantism, none of that stuff is original to the New Testament. None of that stuff had anything to do with original Christianity. It's like, every Christian's like, yeah, I know that. But you can't tell that to a Buddhist. You're like, you know, Theravada, none of that stuff has anything to do with original Buddhism. Like, sure it did. I'm like, no, it doesn't. I find that very funny. It's kind of dry humor. You actually have to have an inside understanding of what's going on that front. So the opposite of life is transcendence. But what is the methodology for transcendence? It'd be the signal without modulation, but the signal without modulation wouldn't technically be a signal. But a signal without modulation, upper sideband, lower sideband, i.e. frequency, yeah, the wavelength, transverse perturbation, that would be vritti, which means perturbation, yeah. Yoga, chitta vritti nirodha, yoga, i.e. samadhi, is the subjugation of chitta perturbations, yeah. That would just literally be saying the subjugation or ending of perturbations of transverse frequency modulations of the signal. The soul is the signal. And you think of a signal as a frequency, like this. You know, I got 162 megahertz tuned in.
And 44 at London.
A radio cannot tune a signal. No radio on Earth can tune a signal. The only thing a radio tunes is modulation of a signal. The phenomenal transverse manifestations, okay, so frequency, wavelength, okay, whatever analogy you want to. Radio analogy is nearly perfect for understanding genuine metaphysics. Can't take it too far. In the case of water, for example, which is analogous to the antenna and the receiving equipment inside this radio, we're talking about a signal that is self-controlling, depending, of course, how much. Free will, of course, is only potential, not actual. It is a living signal. Of course, then we'd have to use an analogy like Terminator, where the actual code is alive. We actually have genuine artificial intelligence. Yeah, the opposite of life is transcendence. The opposite of life is not death. The opposite of life is not disembodiment either, Because disembodiment, by definition, is death. It's like, well, the signal is no longer tuned by the radio. The radio's broken or the battery's dead. Can't tune the signal anymore. Well, that's the opposite of life. No, what it is a signal that is still modulated, that has not yet been picked up by another radio. So this radio broke, I picked up another radio, I was like, oh, here we go again.
Saturday, partly.
Think. Can you hear what I just said on that one? The opposite of life is not disembodiment. The opposite of life is embodiment. It's consubstantiality, matter, and spirit. Therefore, the opposite of life is disembodiment. No, the opposite of life is transcendence. Transcendence is the removing of modulation of that signal. Did I make that clear? I kind of wanted to keep this analogy really, really simple. I know I've used the radio analogy a few times, but I wanted to take it deeper, and it works on so many different levels, and it makes things a lot clearer. People will read hundreds of books like for 50 years to reach that point of simple understanding that I could actually make in like a 20-minute video using my radio analogy. So I hope you liked it. By the way, any donation is warmly welcome. I live cheap and simple. I work 7 days a week. I'm working on my booklet on retroduction. You know, if I had money, I wouldn't be making my fingers hurt working on leatherwork. And I read every comment, so if you're going to leave a nasty comment, that's okay too. I read those also. Smells like buffalo and alligator. Actually, it smells like glue. I'm going to be up to 3 a.m. tonight sewing these wallets. Any donation is always warmly welcome. I hope you all have a lovely holiday and a lovely weekend. I will be busy reading comments, writing, doing leatherwork. I'll be up to 3 o'clock this morning. I was up to 6 a.m. yesterday. That's okay. Lux Everetus. Goodbye.